Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a pre-release analysis on Cyno. Hi. As always, this is a pre-release. All of this information is both subject to change and not tested by myself, which means that it's very possible that once I test it, I realize that there's some things that I'm expecting that aren't actually gonna be as good as I expect them to be, or that are gonna be better than I expect them to be. So just keep that in mind. If you're using information on this video to decide whether or not to wish, tune in on my stream day one of the release, or on my post-release video that I'll get out before the banner is gone. Make sure to not only base your decision whether or not to pull on pre-release information if you're pulling for meta reasons. Always wait until the unit's been out for a few days. As usual, we'll be using Project Ambr to look at the character. I'll leave a link in the description to the website, but yeah, let's get going. I guess we can start with just the talents themselves. So his normal attacks are the same as everyone else. The values on them are actually outdated. The charge attack does a little bit more than it says here because he has had buffs on the beta server apparently. So there's a few things that are different from what is here right now. By the time this video comes out, the website should be updated. But effectively, it's not it. His normal attacks are not what you focus on. The charge attack is actually buffed it, so it's actually like relatively high. So maybe, just maybe, we might see some like meme C6 Bennett plus Cyno vape builds. I don't think they're gonna be good at all, but it's funny numbers, I don't know. As a general rule, just forget about it. Let's take a look at the rest. His E performs a swift thrust, dealing electro damage to opponents along the path. When Cyno is under the Pact Sworn Path Clearer state triggered by Sacred Rite Wolf's Swiftness, so when he's inside of his burst, which we'll look at later, he will instead unleash a Mortuary Rite that deals thunderous AoE electro damage and extends the duration of Pact Sworn Path Clearer. In other words, he's got a 7.5 second cooldown E that deals a meh amount of damage, and then inside of his burst, his cooldown goes to 3 seconds, and the damage is a bit higher. Also, if you use it, it extends your burst duration. His burst is actually really straightforward. It just makes him do electro normal attack, right? That's basically what it does. However, one thing that is important to realize is that, as you guys can see, his burst has its own one-hit scaling, which means that normal attack talents will not matter if you're focusing on his burst, and I don't expect him to have any teams where you focus on his normal attack. However, unlike Raiden, this is not considered burst damage, which means that his burst, so far, from what we expect, and from what we know from leakers, does not work with the Emblem set, but does work with the Gladiator set. It should also work with Beto, but, I mean, look, at this point, wait until he's out and it's been tested just to be 100% sure. Like, actually, just do keep in mind that However's can decide to fuck you over if they feel like it. It can last a maximum of 18 seconds. The base duration is 10. When you use your E, it goes up. He gains immunity to Electro Shard, that doesn't matter. And he gains 100 Elemental Mastery. From the footage we've seen, it really looks like when you use your E outside of your burst and then you use burst, it actually reduces the E cooldown to 3 seconds, or like by 4.5 seconds. So if you do EQ, it's gonna treat it as if you did your E after your burst, basically. However, and this is very important, his E outside of his burst generates 3 particles, and his E inside of his burst generates 1 with a 33% chance to generate 2 instead. Which means that generally, you are going to want to do EQ and not QE. And now let's look at his passives, because his passives are actually very, very relevant. So his first passive, his Ascension 1 passive, is that when he's in his burst, every few seconds he's gonna enter a state. And the state is going to be basically marked by an like big eye on your screen. And when you press E while in that state, it's going to deal more damage and it's going to release 3 projectiles that also deal damage. That state basically happens. The first one is a little bit delayed, but it's basically about every 4 seconds. The first one is after like 5 or 6, but it's generally basically about every 4 seconds. And it lasts for about a second to a second and a half. So for that state, it's basically important that you have your E available when your Ascension 1 state happens. Because of this, and because his E cooldown is 3 seconds, if you use your E off cooldown, then because the cooldown doesn't line up with the timing for this, because the timing for this seems to be around 4 seconds, then if you just use your E off cooldown, you will be missing Ascension 1s. And the Ascension 1 actually does a reasonable amount of damage. Ascension 1 is one of the things that got buffed today. Instead of 50% of his attack, it deals 100% of his attack now, and it's 3 projectiles. So it's actually 300% of his attack, which is more than a talent level 9 E itself. But then on top of that, it also from his other passive deals more damage. We'll take a look at that later. But effectively, right, missing your Ascension 1 is very bad, and you want to try to make sure that you don't do that. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you have your E available every 4 seconds. So his E cooldown, it says 3 seconds, but if you use it every 3 seconds, you're going to miss your Ascension 1, which means it's not actually 3 seconds. It's 4, right? You have to wait until your Ascension 1 happens to get it. Now, this is very important, both if you play him just like this, and for once we get into the artifact section, because he's an electro character, he focuses on reactions, we'll talk about Thundering Fury. And for the first time in a long time, Thundering Fury isn't just going to be a niche set that you can use in some teams, it's actually going to be a very good option. We'll get to that later. Anyways, his Ascension 1, as far as we understand, the Duststalker bolts have a separate internal cooldown from his normal E, but they share internal cooldown. So basically, you'll trigger one reaction with all 3. His E has a separate internal cooldown from everything else, which means it's always going to trigger a reaction. Obviously, if there's an aura on the enemy, if you actually have a reaction to trigger, it's always going to apply Electro. And then his normal attacks have normal internal cooldown. So finally, his Ascension 1 also got a buff. So it's not 125%, it's 150% now. But basically, his normal attack damage is increased by 150% of his elemental mastery. And the way that this buff works is it's an additive buff. So it basically ends up working like Zhongli's like HP percent scaling on his talents. And then the Duststalker bolts are increased by 250% instead of 150. Basically, here's how Cyno is gonna end up scaling. You've got his normal stuff that scales with attack. Then if you play him in aggravate teams, you will have aggravate damage that scales with EM and also crit and damage percent. You'll have his Duststalker bolt that scale with attack, but also with elemental mastery and also crit and damage percent. And then his normal attacks also have slightly higher elemental mastery scaling. Because of those elemental mastery scalings, if you end up playing him in an aggravate team, it is generally going to be better to go for an elemental mastery sense than an attack sense. Because you're not just getting your normal aggravate stuff, you're also getting some EM scaling. Now, the specifics of it are gonna depend on which weapon you end up using, but we can look at, for example, Deathmatch for now. So the increase from an EM sense is positive, but it's not that much. It's right 2 point something percent, close to 3. So basically, EM sense is better because he has aggravate and elemental mastery scaling, but it's not better by a massive amount to the point where you don't wanna, you wanna just ignore attack sense. If you have a good attack sense, you can very easily just use that. That being said, if you play him in teams where he doesn't trigger a lot of reactions, that shifts the balance towards attack, and if you end up getting aggravates and hyper blooms or something like that, that shifts the balance towards elemental mastery. Let's very, very quickly look at his constellations because fuck constellations. So his C1 gives him 20% attack speed, basically. Attack speed is kind of shit. He attacks pretty quickly, which means that he hits enemies pretty often, which means that he actually has a pretty high amount of hit lag. So apparently, I'm told he has slightly lower hit lag than usual, but the point still stands that every time you hit enemies, there's a few frames where the game pauses itself, where you can still move your camera, but you can't, your character isn't moving anymore. And attack speed is calculated before hit lag. So when you have 20% attack speed, it doesn't actually give you 20% faster attacks. It's actually a lot less than that. And then on top of that, because 20% attack speed isn't 20% more damage, because A, a bunch of his damage comes from his E, which doesn't deal more damage with attack speed, and B, it's not 100% certain that that attack speed is going to help you line up a significant amount more aggravates. So basically, it's a fine constellation, but it's not great. His C2 has actually been changed. It isn't this anymore. From what we know, it's been changed to, instead of 3% crit rate and 6% crit damage, it's just 10% electro damage, stacking up to 5 times, so up to 50% electro damage. And it's not just normal attack crit, it's all electro damage. So basically what ends up happening is you hit normal attacks very often, so you're basically gonna have 5 stacks most of the time. So it's gonna be almost a 50% buff. On average, it's gonna be closer to 46, 47, whatever. It's about 50% electro damage. It's a good constellation. constellation. It's not like insane, but it is like a nice constellation. I would never recommend constellations because I think on 5 stars, because I think unless they change gameplay, you're just doing slightly bigger numbers. That's not like, do you really want to spend all of your Primogens for slightly bigger numbers instead of new characters that have exciting gameplay? Personally, I would never do that. I know that some people want the bigger numbers, and obviously if that's you, I'm not gonna stop you. And it's an okay constellation for that, but just keep in mind that when you're going for constellations, it means that your Primogens aren't going towards a new character or support that works well with him or something like that. This is Burst Constellation. It's pretty good, but in aggravate teams, a lot of his damage comes from the aggravate, which means that his talent levels aren't actually as good as talent levels on other characters can be. It's still okay, but it's not insane. His C4 basically makes him Raiden. When you trigger an electro reaction while he's on field, he restores 3 energy to party members up to 5 times, so 15 energy. It's good, but it's, again, right, it's not crazy, it's not insane. It's for a C4, it's pretty His C5 has the same issue as a C3, where a lot of his damage is coming from aggravates. And then his C6 basically gives him the 1 Duststalker bolt from his passive every time he normal attacks, kinda. Because you get 4 stacks per E, and you can get 4 normal attacks in on after each E on TF, but again, we'll talk about TF later. Basically, it increases his damage by a pretty significant amount because you get additional motion value and additional EM scaling, but it doesn't change his playstyle. It's a C6. Fuck that. TLDR constellations, they're okay. They're not like underwhelming. They're basically in line with other constellations. None of them actually changes playstyle significantly, so I personally wouldn't really recommend any of them. And I never recommend constellations at all. Just reminding you guys that unless you just really like the bigger numbers and you have a lot of disposable income, that's just not worth it. So let's start by talking about his weapons. His weapons are actually very interesting because there are actually a lot of weapons that have some synergies with him. Let's write down all the polearms that you could use on him, and then talk about the pros and cons, and then rank them at the end. Let's start by looking at the ones that are just not good. Wavebreaker increases burst damage, but his normal attacks and bursts don't seem to count as burst damage, so it would suck. Same for the catch. Royal just sucks in general. Crescent Pike is a physical damage weapon. Not great. Dragon's Bane is an interesting one, where it's kind of okay, but in a lot of the teams where you'll end up playing him, I mean, you want to keep Quicken on the enemy, and when you're going Quicken, that means you can't have a Hydro or Pyro Aura on the enemy, which means that it just doesn't get the passive, and if that's the case, then there's better choices. However, if you end up going for a Cyno team where you go for stuff other than Quicken, there can be situations where Dragon's Bane is good. I think all the other weapons are worth talking about, so let's go through them. The main thing about Engulfing is that it gives you too much ER. From what I've looked at, in most of Cyno's teams, he doesn't actually need that much ER. He does look like he needs some. You can actually do a quick ER calc on him, so the total amount of energy that you generate before energy recharge in this team with Favonius Zhongli, Favonius Dendro main character, and Beidou with a missed parry is around 66, which would mean that his energy requirements hover around 120%. If you don't end up using Thundering Fury, it will be closer to 145. That being said, right, these aren't the only teams where you can use him. I think the ones that are relevant for the weapon comparison are this one, the Fischl one. So we're basically going to be looking at what happens if you use Fischl instead. And as you can see, right, on TF with Fischl, he doesn't need any energy recharge. That's less than 100, and you start with 100. And on non-TF, you still need about 15, right? So this is Beidou, Fischl, and finally, the last one we're gonna do is Solo Electro. And on Solo Electro, you don't get the Electro Resonance, and you don't get off-field electro particles, so this is just 0. And as you can see, his energy recharge requirements can actually end up being quite a bit higher. Now, obviously, if you're running him solo electro, you'll have a last unit that does something else, right? Maybe you end up using, I don't know, maybe you end up using Kazuha on an Iron Sting or on a Favonius. It's gonna be hard to have both main character and Kazuha on Favonius. Let's just assume your Kazuha's on Iron Sting. You're gonna get 1 or 2 Kazuha E's. Let's be optimistic and assume 2 E's. And it's still, like, as you can see, relatively high energy requirements, especially if you don't end up going for Thundering Fury. But even on solo Electro, it's still at the very most 180, and obviously, right, you don't go a set other than TF if he's solo Electro. TF on top of the damage comparison, which we'll look at later, that actually favors Thundering Fury without looking at energy recharge, also lets you run like 40% less when he's solo Electro. And the reason why that's very relevant here is because Engulfing Lightning gives you 55% from the substat and another 30 from the passive. So what ends up happening in this case is that you end up wasting a lot of Engulfing Lightning's passive, which makes it not that great. So, meh. Staff of Scarlet Sands is his signature weapon. We can take a look at it real quick. It has a low base attack, high substat on crit rate, and it converts Elemental Mastery to flat attack. It's a very good weapon for him. It is going to be his best option, but as you guys are going to see later, there are actually some really good 4-star options, which means that even though it is going to be his best weapon, I probably would never end up like recommending getting it just specifically for Cyno. But it is going to be his best weapon. Vortex Vanquisher is very interesting because it's a massive attack percent stat stick. But like we talked about earlier, you end up building a pretty decent amount of elemental mastery on Cyno. And the way that aggravate works is your aggravate damage does not look at your attack, which means that weapons that give you high attack are going to increase your talent damage, but are not going to do anything to your aggravate damage. So if you have a fuck ton of attack, then yeah, that's very nice, but you're only increasing part of your damage instead of all of your damage. And when you look at other different weapons that give you the same amount of stats, but stats that multiply all of your damage instead, like damage percent or crit, they will generally end up being better. Because of that, Vortex Vanquisher is generally not going to be ideal. Basically what I ended up doing is I look at his damage that he would do if he had like not even a level 1 beginner's protector, but he had that minus the base attack that beginner's protector gives you. And then I just looked at how much better specific weapons were going to be. And as you guys can see, if we take a look at Vortex Vanquisher, this is while you're shielded. It's worse than Deathmatch. The main reason for that is because Deathmatch's crit increases aggravate damage too, not just the attack, right? Not just the talent damage, but also it increases the damage that you get from his Ascension passive. These things can also crit, but attack percent doesn't increase this damage. It only increases the 100%, not 50, that you get from this. And that's when you're shielded. When you're not shielded, it's significantly worse. So basically, Vortex Vanquisher is gonna be a no. Jade Spear is the first example of a weapon that's actually pretty okay for him, because Jade Spear has a crit rate substat and gives you damage percent from the passive. And so Jade Spear is going to be one of the options that's better than his 4-star alternatives, but not as good as his 5-star weapon. Calamity Queller has a bit of the same issue as Vortex does, where it's just kind of an attack percent stat stick, but it does have a little bit of damage percent, so it ends up being slightly better if I remember correctly. Yeah, it's about as good as Vortex when shielded. No. Homa gives you attack on the passive, which isn't ideal, but it's still a beneficial substat. But it's not the main one you're looking for. But it does have a crit substat, which is good, which is what you're looking for specifically, which means that it's pretty good. If you look at the weapon comparison I have, Homa is around the same level as Jade Spear. Now, if I remember correctly, on Jade Spear, I ended up assuming slightly optimistic uptime. Yeah, these are 6 stack average instead of 7, and the damage percent is 10% average instead of 12. You can expect about a 1 to 2% damage difference between my calc and how it's actually going to perform, which means that basically, right, Jade Spear and Homa are mostly interchangeable. Now on Cyno, you don't really have a way to deal damage to yourself, so it's hard to get the Homa passive. But if you do get the Homa passive, then Homa should be better than Jade Spear. That being said, if you end up staying on field for a very long time, Jade Spear gains in value because the longer you stay on field, the higher the portion of your time on field is spent with full stacks, right? It increases your average. All in all, I would say that Homa and Jade Spear are like basically both about as good. Homa being slightly better when you're under 50% and slightly worse when you're over. It's just another good weapon. If you have both, just use whichever one gets you the better crit ratio. Like that's how close they are, basically. Serpent Spine. Serpent Spine is a very interesting one. Or not Serpent Spine, Skyward Spine. So if you just look at this, you're like, okay, well, I guess it's just not a great weapon, right? You end up having Skyward Spine pretty fucking low. But, and this is very important, Skyward Spine still gives you a decent amount of ER. And like we said, Engulfing isn't great because it gives you way more ER than you need. But if you end up playing a team where you need 140, 150 ER, then the ER on Spine is actually really useful, because Spine lets you get away with artifacts that don't have energy recharge rolls, which means you'll be able to get higher stats, you'll be able to get higher crit, higher EM, higher attack, or whatever. And so it's hard to compare one-to-one with Skyward Spine because of that. Spine also gives you a little bit of attack speed. Now, we've talked about why attack speed isn't insane, but it is still a stat that will increase your damage. And because we don't have footage of Cyno with Skyward Spine yet, we can't really tell how much of an increase on his damage the attack speed is going to be exactly. You're gonna get more attacks? Are you gonna get more aggravates? I don't really expect that 12% is enough to get more aggravates. I do expect it to let you basically get a little bit more damage, but it really shouldn't be that significant. You also get the little bit of like physical damage that doesn't do that much, but it is still there, and I haven't looked at it here. Let's actually take a look. This is Skyward Spine, pessimistic assumptions. Let's look at Serpent Spine, optimistic assumptions. So the optimistic assumptions are: you're gaining 30% ER, that's 5.5, let's say 5 rolls of ER, which means that you get to run up to 5 more rolls of the good stats you want. Generally, that's not going to be one-to-one like that. It's going to depend on your artifact's RNG, obviously. But again, right, this is looking at the optimistic assumption. And when you're going under those assumptions, then Skyward Spine is actually about as good as Deathmatch. It should also be a little bit easier to play because, as we'll talk about later, some of his combos might be a little bit mechanically difficult to get properly, and the attack speed should make it more fluid. So I'm basically just doing this to like say that there are going to be situations where Skyward Spine is a viable option. It's generally going to be pretty meh, but there are going to be situations for it. Now, prototype Starglitter. So it basically has the same thing as Skyward Spine, where you can go for pessimistic or optimistic assumptions, which would again put it around the same ballpark. That being said, it offers more energy recharge than Skyward Spine does, and that could actually be a pretty big problem because, like we looked at, right, you don't need that much. At 45.9, which is what Starglitter gives you, this basically makes it so that any ER rolls on your artifacts are completely wasted. So like, when your weapon by itself gives you all the ER you need, it's more difficult to get to those optimistic assumptions. And you're generally not going to be as close to the optimistic assumptions as you would be on a weapon that gives you less ER, right? So just keep that in mind. And so as a general rule, it's also actually not that great. Moonpiercer is the new craftable one, and it can basically give you an attack buff. You or a teammate, but generally it's going to be him. And it gives you elemental mastery. It's okay, right? You do get stats that are okay, but you'll have better options, including better free-to-play options. So generally, that's going to be a no. Lithic Spear is basically just going to be a no. You can get a decent amount of melee characters, but you don't care enough about attack. And Lithic gives you too many buffs that are just attack. It has a small amount of crit rate that can get okay with like 3 melee characters and R5, but like it's not worth it. Now let's get to the Kitain Cross Spear, or the Kitten Spear. The Kitten Spear is very interesting because it's a weapon that can give you energy. When you use a skill, you lose 3 energy, but you regenerate 3 energy every 2 seconds, 3 times. So 9. So it's plus 6 energy, basically. At Refinement 5, this goes up to 5, and so you lose 3, gain 15, so it's plus 12 energy. You stay on the field long enough to activate the effect twice. So basically, at R1, it'll be plus 6 twice, so plus 12, and at R5, it'll be plus 12 twice, so plus 24. So if we look at what happens when your ER requirements go down by 24, we do not end up needing much ER, do we? So it ends up being a weapon that, even though it doesn't have energy recharge on it, it does basically give you energy recharge. And it's an actual good amount of energy recharge. So again, the Kitain Crossbear is actually a weapon where its value is going to depend on whether or not you need that energy recharge. Now, because the Kitain Crossbear can actually be a lot more, right? It can basically be the equivalent of between 20 and like 50 energy recharge. Most of the time is going to be closer to 20, but there will be situations where you get around 40 if you're running Cyno as a solo Electro. And if you are getting about 40, then the actual amount you're gaining is going to be more than what I put as my optimistic assumptions. And you can actually get something closer to like the equivalent of 7 rolls of crit, which would actually make it competitive with Deathmatch. That being said though, it is important to remember that basically in a lot of Cyno's team, he is not going to need that much energy recharge, right? Like this is actually generally going to be the amount of ER you're more or less going for. Because of that, the value from the Kitain Cross Spear isn't actually that much. The Kitain Cross Spear is going to be a situationally best in slot free to play. Now, Favj. We don't need to look at the damage on Favj. Favj's damage is not going to be very good. We can do it anyways, just to like quantify what I mean by not very good. And as we can see, it's pretty fucking bad. But just like all the other energy recharge weapons, you can go for more optimistic assumptions if it saves you some energy recharge. And it also generates energy recharge for the rest of your team. If you end up playing him with Beto, that's relevant. As a general rule, I would say that in the teams that are really focused around Cyno, you shouldn't run him on Fav. But if you just like Cyno and you want to put him in your existing teams, we'll talk about it when we get to teams, but there are going to be teams where Fav is actually a good option. But I will say, generally meh. Dragon's Bane, if you end up going for Hyper Bloom stuff, it can actually be pretty okay, but generally it just won't be what you're going for. So, meh.
In Hyper Bloom teams, you will often run Solo Electro, so the Kitain Cross Spear will generally be better.
Deathmatch. Deathmatch is generally going to be your best Sorcerer option, and it's not that far behind Homa and Jade Spear because it gives more crit value than Homa and Jade Spear. And generally it's very far behind because it doesn't give a lot of attack, but on Cyno, like we said, attack isn't as important as it usually is. That is Refinement 1, by the way. Take a look at Refinement 5, I guess. Alright, and that makes it go a little bit ahead of Jade Spear and Homa. It's not a free-to-play option, obviously, but it is a good 4-star option if you have it. But yeah, so generally, best in slot, 4-star. Blackcliff, right, this is with 1 stock. It's actually pretty okay. Good free-to-play option. And here's where shit gets interesting. Let's talk about White Tassel. It gives you a crit rate substat as a 3-star weapon, and it increases normal attack damage by 48% at Refinement 5. Now, this is actually very, very interesting, because like we said, when you're doing aggravate things, damage percent and crit scale both your talent and your aggravate stuff, whereas attack only scales your talent stuff. Which means that in Cyno's case, because he's a character where most of his damage comes from his normal attack, not like 90%, but still a very significant portion of his damage from his normal attacks. So he gets that damage percent on a significant portion of his damage, and it's a crit weapon. Now, usually you don't really play White Tassel because of its low base attack, but because you don't care about base attack as much as usual, then that's less of a downside than usual. And so what ends up actually happening is you have White Tassel just actually being a good option. It's gonna be not quite as good as a high refinement Lithic Spear. I mean, about as good as Calamity Queller and Vortex Vanquisher when shielded. Not as good as the incredibly optimistic assumption for prototype Starglitter. But like I said, these assumptions are basically never gonna happen. Same for Skyward Spine, and same for Kitain Cross Spear. Which means that these 3 weapons, generally, these assumptions are going to be unrealistic and is going to be less than that, which means that your best free-to-play option, generally, is actually going to be the White Tassel. Now, if you need the energy recharge, then the Kitain Cross Spear becomes the potential best weapon. But otherwise, White Tassel is actually going to generally be his best option for a free-to-play weapon. So, generally, best in slot, free-to-play.
Also, if you play Cyno on a set other than Thundering Fury, then more of his damage comes from normal attacks, which makes White Tassel even more competitive.
And because White Tassel is so good, I'm actually going to change Blackcliff to just meh. Because why would you go Blackcliff when you can go White Tassel that doesn't have a condition? Now keep in mind, White Tassel is a weapon that you can only get from chests, not from gacha, which means that if you've already fully explored Liwa, and you've already used your weapons as fodder, which I know is the case for a lot of people, it was the case for me. I'm lucky enough that they released the Chasm, and I'll be able to farm for a White Tassel there because Chasm counts as Liwa, and White Tassel can only be found in Liwa chests. But I know that some people have just foddered all their White Tassels and just won't have one. If that's the case, I would encourage you to generally gravitate towards the Kitain Cross Spear as your free-to-play option. It's such a small difference, and they're fucking 5-star weapons. So I'll put White Tassel here. Then we'll have the Kitain Cross Spear. Then we're gonna have Vortex Vanquisher, Calamity Queller, Skyward Spine, Engulfing Lightning, Prototype Starglitter. I'm not even gonna put Prototype Starglitter because it's just worse than Kitain. Oh yeah, I should talk about the fucking windspear. Missive windspear. And as you guys can see, it's okay, but it is generally going to be slightly worse than White Tassel. So again, it's an okay option if you don't have a White Tassel because you ended up feeding it. I'd probably place it actually right here. Missive windspear. Okay. Then we'll have Favj, situational for non-traditional themes. And then we'll have Dragon's Bane, situational for Hyper Bloom or other transformative reactions. Moonpiercer, I'm not going to include because it's a free-to-play weapon. If you can craft a Moonpiercer, you can craft a Kitain Cross Spear. And I would recommend Kitain Cross Spear over Moonpiercer basically every time. Lithic, I'm not going to include. And Blackcliff, I'm also not going to include because it's a conditional weapon that is about as good as the Missive Windspear. And you need to get it with Starglitter, so I'm not going to include that. So here is the general weapons, more or less ranked, but again, right, it's very possible that the weapon that's ranked lower is better in specific situations than another.